if you, do you have your bulletin, or if you have your Bible with you, or your Bible, either way.
Here you go.
Basically, we just want to go.
And then I'll take the Bible. How's that?
Yeah, so Matthew chapter 17,
Okay.
and it's verses 1 through 9. And I'm just curious, which translation do you have?
RSV.
Okay, RSV, okay.
Yeah, the old RSV.
The RSV before they kind of, yeah, it's not, it's very few little,
right.
yeah, they just have a few little
Yeah.
clicks there and there.
Mhm.
So again, today, obviously, as we've already heard, this is the Transfiguration. And it is kind of this kind of very mystical event. And when I was mentioned, there were a lot of, there weren't really churches named that for a long time in our church, because, us Western Christians tend to like what we can, we're people also of the, the intellect and rational and thinking and all this. And we relate very easy to Jesus when he's interacting with people and doing this. But here we have Jesus in a whole nother thing where he goes up and he is, in a sense, glorified in this very mystical experience. He goes up Mount Tabor and he takes those three, Peter, James, and John, and he takes them and they begin seeing what's going on. And you have this odd thing of where they see Jesus, and all of a sudden Moses and Elijah are there with him. And they're having like this conversation. And I'm like, well, that must have been interesting. So they're having this conversation. And of course, it is very clear that there's a reason why it's Moses and Elijah. If you notice, Jesus, he says at least 2 times where he says, I've not come to abolish the law, or the prophet. He says, but I came to fulfill them. And he talks, and he said, the great commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, heart, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Well, Moses is the representative of the law. Elijah is of the prophets. So it's really the 2 major parts of what is considered the scriptures, and especially for Jews at this time. The Torah, the law, and then all of the prophets who tell of what is coming. And also what, not just what's coming, but also what is happening to them then, and the call to change and to be who they are, the people of God. And then say, we also look with hope for the future. And so Jesus, in a sense, is this image of the Transfiguration is saying, God is manifesting that sense of again, with Moses when he goes on the mountain, and we hear his face is changing when he comes down. They have to put a cloth over it because it's, and of course we're kind of wondering, like, okay, that's kind of weird, how was, and part of us today goes like, well, I'm doing much better with Jesus kind of teaching and healing the sick and everything than this kind of mount. And of course, this is actually where originally people started using the term a mountaintop experience that you just hear in everyday lingo, comes from the understanding of Jesus going on the mountaintop and being glorified, this transfiguration. And of course, it's that who is there is important. Like I said, with Moses and Elijah, it's very important that there's the witnesses, the 3. And in one of the, I think it's in Luke, it says, they kind of fall to the ground. They are so overwhelmed. Again, in the presence of something that is incredible and majestic, this majesty, and they're like, we don't often talk about the transcendence, the omnipotence, and the omnipresence of God, which we believe, but we don't talk about that we talk about a God who's so close and very near to us and in relationship. But it's also the same God who is the holy other, the one that, they used to use the word fear of the Lord, but, has today not really good connotations. But in the sense, this awesomeness or awestruck, this of saying, I realize I am not God. Here is God. And there's a sense of reverence with that you show. Out of a sense, hopefully out of love and not out of fear.
Well, why is it that he said, don't tell anybody about this.
Okay,
Sorry.
very important. Actually, that's a big key. He does this in a couple of places, and he does it a lot, mainly in Mark's gospel. Mark had what you call the messianic secret, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So Matthew, of course, took things from Mark's gospel written first. He was looking at that, so he includes that secret there. Okay, now it's interesting again. Peter talks about it's so good and to be there, and let's make some dwellings, just kind of hang out here. And of course, it's when that the cloud overshadows them, and it's the same exact words that is used at Jesus' baptism. We began the Epiphany season with the baptism of Jesus, where we heard, "This is my Son, my beloved, and with whom I'm well pleased." So it's kind of the God acknowledging the beginning of his ministry and saying, this is good, he's the one. Now, this is coming right to the end of Jesus' earthly ministry before he goes to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday and then the events of Holy Week. So he goes there, and there's a final acknowledgement of this is not only the one in the sense of the Son of Man, but the Son of God, this glory. And there's that addition. And it kind of goes with this messianic secret thing. When it says, listen to him, is very important in here. And it's used, all the transfiguration stories in the gospel include that. About after he says the same thing at the baptism, he says, listen to him. And that's different. And part of that also is because of what is coming. Listen to him. And so it said that's when they were overcome by fear, but Jesus came and touched them, saying, get up and do not be afraid. And then here's another key, the last verse where it says, not the last verse, but the one before. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. There's the sense, they've just heard this acknowledgement from the Father that this is the beloved. And there was, all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah are gone. It's in a sense coming back to saying it's an acknowledgement he has fulfilled and that he alone is the one. He's the one of the law and the prophets, the fulfilling of God's salvation history, the story of salvation. And so this event seems kind of, but it's very poignant of what it's trying to say to the early disciples and to us. So they all of a sudden, Jesus himself alone. So Jesus, it's kind of like her growing up a lot, no one but Jesus. Jesus. So he's the one. And then it says, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. In Mark's gospel, sometimes it'll say, and he just orders them sternly, do not tell anybody. Now, what this is about is, okay, you are my disciples, the ones whom I've been teaching to preparing. Because the whole thing about Jesus really is he seems to know this. The disciples don't know it really until the day of Pentecost. That what Jesus is doing is preparing them to take on the ministry of what we say the gospel of Jesus, and to be the one who's going to be doing that. So there's this thing though about you won't understand it, and there's all these other places where Jesus has it's kind of a real aha moment, and he says, don't tell anybody. It's because don't tell anyone, because if they focus on just some miraculous event or something like that, they're not going to understand what God is doing until you understand it in light of the crucifixion and the resurrection. The fulfillment of all that Jesus says is the cross and the resurrection. So, and here in Matthew's, it goes and actually says that, because it says, until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. So in a sense, you only really understand the transfiguration. You really only understand the baptism. Everything about Jesus' life in light of it comes to the fulfillment of him coming and what he does in Jerusalem, and then how raised from the dead, and that is the fulfillment of all that is the law and the prophets. That Jesus is saying for them, don't tell anyone, not until then. And in a sense, if you just hear bits and pieces about Jesus, people could get, and still do, even in the mainstream of Christianity, get off in tangents about certain things in his life without fully understanding. It's like when the Apostle Paul later on says, he's talking about when people are kind of getting off and all these things, and he says, no, we preach Christ crucified and risen from the dead. That, you only understand it all in the light of that. And then once you understand that, these other things make sense about who he is and what he was trying to teach. So it's, you don't hear it in every one of the Gospels. Luke doesn't say much about that. Don't tell. But there is this sense of he's wanting them not to go off and say, hey, guess what we saw? And you'll need to, and saying, wait till you fully understand it before you tell others. And it seems odd to us because, one of the worst ones is, there's the one of the Christmas readings ends with the shepherds go back and everything, and it says, and they were warned in a dream, to da-da-da-da and all this stuff, that the shepherds went back and they told no one. And one of the things about Christianity is about telling, sharing. Hey, there's good news. It's all about saying we should be, evangelists. Evangel means messengers, ones who go and are messages of what Jesus has taught us. But it's interesting, in some of these big things, you kind of get this, they told no one. Oh, and about Mary, and she treasured all these things, and she told no one.
She kept it in her heart.
She kept, yeah. And, and then you've got, at the resurrection, when he sees Mary Magdalene, Jesus at the tomb, and he goes, but he says, go and tell my disciples. And then, of course, she goes and tells the disciples, and then it all just stops. They're like, oh, okay, well, that's what she said. There's this whole sense of, if you notice, right up until the moment of really, 50 days after the resurrection at the Feast of the Tabernacles at Pentecost, that when the Holy Spirit comes, they go, oh. There's this sense of, all of a sudden they let go of all their fears of like, okay, they're coming to kill us too. And they go out in the street. And so there's this sense of we only understand what we do in the full understanding of the whole life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I don't know if that kind of makes sense a little bit. It's odd for us because you're going, well, you tell them all this stuff and then you tell them don't tell anybody? What's...
You don't want to show them something shiny before they really get the whole picture.
And we do like our shiny, squirrel. We get easy on this. But, it's here that, and it's even in the hymn we sang at the beginning, that it's from here. It says, when it comes down, if you keep reading, it'll say, Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem. And that's does it say it in Matthew there?
As they go down, Jesus kind of, not here, but it was probably.
It's probably a little further down or something like that. He sets his face.
That we have the epileptic right after that.
Okay. It's somewhere. That's okay, but
Yeah.
it may not. Matthew may not have included it. Mark may have it. I'm not sure, but you have him to where at this point he's saying, kind of the transfiguration is the last kind of almost this deep spiritual thing for these disciples as they're getting ready to face something that they have no idea how bad is what's coming. And they begin actually trying to talk Jesus out of everything he's doing. They're like, no, Jesus, you do this, you're gonna upset the religious officials and the government, which he does. And quite honestly, if we still are doing that today, we probably should get the ire of religious officials in our governments to some extent. But so if you notice, I'm just curious, just kind of growing up and everything, did you ever hear really people talk about this event of Jesus? Because there's all these big events in Jesus. This is considered a big one, but did you ever hear it really talked about, or did you know what the Transfiguration was?
From my growing up period, I think when it was talked about, it was spoken about in the context of how you of people claiming that you could get a sense of holiness or wickedness from people by their countenance, by what they looked like.
Oh, I see.
Which I think is,
interesting.
on the one hand, a tempting perspective, but on the other hand, I tend to view it now from that's just inviting you to either fall into somebody's charisma or judge them for being too ugly. If that makes sense.
Yeah, there's this thing in here about saying that their appearance will kind of tell you, well, that's pretty subjective.
Yeah.
And I think that if you want their appearance to be a certain way, we tend to set it up for what we already have presuppositions about what is good or bad. It's.
So I tend
see how they went there, but
there's a lot of because you don't want to fall into the trap of believing that someone is righteous because they're giving off upper middle class vibes. I'm just throwing it out there, and you don't want to fall into the trap of believing that someone is wicked because they look exhausted and stressed, or they're giving off poverty vibes or fringe culture vibes or something. I mean, there's so many ways that you can make inappropriate judgments if you expect to be able to detect righteousness by someone's looks. In more recent post-faith transition, where I reset everything, as I was mentioning earlier, I think I've mostly interacted with this text through the lens of Thomas Keating's writings. He's a Trappist monk who is a big proponent of meditation practices, and he tends to talk about it in the context of the spiritual journey and how when we have charismatic events or gifts, or encounter people with charismatic events or gifts in their life, that it's very easy for someone who's experiencing them to get puffed up with pride and to fall into idolatry of worshiping those special events in their life.
And wanting to, like Peter, let's stay here. This is the way. This is it.
But that in the spiritual path, as traditionally written about, the occurrence of these peak spiritual experiences doesn't really tell you much about somebody's spiritual growth. And if they're beneficial, that's great. But in the long term, there's going to be a period of darkness in your life where God seems to withdraw, and the gifts all seem to disappear, and everything seems gone, and that God is more likely to be working in your life in those moments of despair, where you're taught humility, because you have to, all the unconscious assumptions that you gather to yourself when you believe that you're experiencing these charismatic gifts, all has to get undone again. That God has to teach you to be humble, and that the humility and faithfulness that you learn in those dark periods and the transformations that happen to you in those dark periods are really what the dominant way that God is working through people, not these shiny moments. Not that they're invaluable or valueless, but that we tend to overvalue them, and only some people experience those things, and that we shouldn't believe that some people are especially righteous because they talk about them or have them, and that honestly people who have them probably should be talking about them less, because when they bring them up, the temptation of pride is ever present. So, and Jesus saying, don't talk about this. If you're viewing it from the perspective of people who are having charismatic gifts or experiences in their life, today, that's what you'd expect them to do if they were spiritually healthy.
And there's a sense where they're called actually to live into the gifts, not put them on parade.
Yes.
And I've seen this because part of my background was in some of the charismatic things. And what happened is I remember this one church all the time, and people didn't realize. I mean, I was always sort of like, are you hear what you're saying? They would say, oh, well, we're a real church. We're where the Spirit is. We're not like those dead churches. They are, they made it very clear, if you didn't do what they did and what they experienced, you were inferior and you did not know God as much as they did. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, oh, no. Have you heard anything Jesus taught?
I had the Pastor Ernie Love. And the irony doesn't stop there, but he preached, feminism was a step to fascism, which is a step to Nazism, and I had to sit there through this whole service.
Oh my gosh!
I wanted to leave, but it was a real small church, and I can sit here, I can.
Oh boy!
This. But there's.
Yeah, and here's a real good example, and I just saw the story again. Amazing! It was like about a week ago that there was an Episcopal church. That was calling a new rector, new priest. And they knew he was getting ready to come in like a couple of weeks or a week or so. And it was a very white, mostly very affluent, upper middle class, white congregation in a very nice neighborhood of, a city like, Atlanta or, Denver or something like, and I don't remember where exactly, but it fit kind of all those stereotypes, in the sense of that. And they had a lot of money, and they had big programs and fancy and all this stuff. And so the guy who had interviewed told them, said, I think you all, and I'm surprised they called him because he said, you need to be challenged about who are you, and then how do you live into the gospel in our communities? Well, what he did is the Sunday before he was to start, he came dressed and looked like he was dirty and shoveled and as a person on the street. And he came in with ragged clothes, kind of hair all messed up and everything like this. And no one had seen him. And he came and the ushers met him and said, oh, I think you're looking for the rescue mission. That's on this part of town over there. That's where you need to go. So they just presumed. They didn't say, okay, well, welcome, here's a bulletin, anything like that. They just said, oh, you need to go there. Mm-hmm. So he walked around outside and stuff, and then he came back in. And then he said, no, well, I want to come to the service. He said, you can sit on the back row back here. We don't want to look, it was this thing very clear. We don't want him up in the midst of, us normal, clean people. And so he had to sit in the back on the side in a chair and was there for the whole service. When it came up to communion, he said people just glared as he came up. And he said they made kind of an extra berth around him at the altar. Of communion. They didn't want to get too close to everything. And so the next Sunday came, and he was standing at the back of the church in his collar and his suit and everything like that. No, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. The next Sunday came, and he was waiting in the back, and he told him, I'm going to be in the back until you introduce me. He came dressed exactly the same way. And they said, it's our pleasure and to introduce to you our new rector, the Reverend so-and-so. And so he walks in from the back in the narthex like this down the middle aisle with people just, you can just imagine after, because they recognized him from last week, and he got up and came to the pulpit and said, hi, I'm your new priest. And said, we need to talk. and I mean, can you imagine them going like, oh, crap. You know, it's
Yeah.
like,
Oh, I mean, talk about a year's worth of sermons. And
yeah, I mean, well, and that
Yeah.
began really for the first year and a half. You began a journey of saying we need to look both at our minds, our hearts, and who we really are. What do we say the church really is, and who are we? And the thing about it is I'm actually amazed that he had that much bravery, because some churches I can see them afterwards saying, "I think we'll talk to the bishop that maybe you should not be our rector." Because
Yeah.
that was kind of risky, where he came up and right on his introduction, he kind of chastised them and said, But see, that's the whole thing of people, appearances,
well, and if he hadn't chastised them initially, if he'd let it go on even for another few weeks before he kind of took them to task, then it wouldn't have had the same impact.
yeah.
Wow.
It always makes me feel kind of sad. I remember there was a few years ago, I don't know if you've heard of this or not, there was a man who would show up at our parish.
Kind of disruptive.
Sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes he was just calm, and he had a history of attending on and off when he was in town for several years. And then yes, there was an event where he started getting disruptive, started showing up and disrupting meetings of groups that were being held here, or and showed up, got into a fight with an usher. It was
Well, didn't I hear that he would, right when Steve was giving a sermon, he would stand up. I heard this guy would stand up and start blah 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 blah, and Steve would just stop and step off to the side.
I wasn't there for such an occurrence,
Okay.
but there were definitely instances where the interactions weren't as calm, and or Steve telling him you need to calm down or quiet down or leave, and it was unfortunate that this happened, and it's and that he had to be told that he wasn't allowed to come back because he had been getting showing up and getting violent, and within a week or two after that happened, he actually got arrested for brandishing a gun at a haircuttery place, and he just randomly showed up, started waving a gun. I don't know what I'm doing. Apparently the article said he was arrested, and he said he didn't know why he had done it. He just he was just in a really dark place, and it's and you want to be the church where someone who's going through hell, economically, mentally, or whatever, could come and be safe. And having that incident where, there was a legitimate reason why he couldn't come back if he was going to show up and try to get into fistfights with the ushers, but I mean, it's just sad.
It's one of those ones. There's not and I hate using this analogy, but it's kind of a no-win in the sense that we know we want to be compassionate. We should, and in this case, though, there's certain boundaries though that you can't cross. But it's always tough. It's really tough.
Yeah.
I had a guy in one of my congregations who had very bad mental illness, and he would come and he would threaten to kill people and stuff, and it was and he actually tried to run me over in front of the rectory and then he brandished a knife on me, and he said, "Both of us are dying tonight." So I go, God, and it was about 5 below zero the night he did that, and on a small drive, and I had to stand out there for about 45 minutes trying to talk him down. Because he had his knife right there. It was one of those big hunting knives and stuff. And finally, I got into a place and everything. But and then unfortunately, I had to call the police. And I didn't want to. And I told them, I said, I'm not interested in punishing him. I just need to know, I'm not going to be murdered in front of the rectory. But it's hard.
And that he could be taken care of.
Yeah.
Or whatever that, however that's defined at that point.
Yeah. And it was a family, the whole family, it was just one of those sad situations. And the congregation I was at, was doing things to help them, and with food and things for the kids, and, and after that, we still, wanted to provide to try to help. But, he just couldn't be there because he wouldn't take his medication, or if he did, he would take all of it at once. So, yeah. So, but yeah, it's difficult when you're dealing with this. But did you hear about the Transfiguration very much?
We were
Or?
in the Methodist Church, especially when growing up, and I think they were more focused on Peter.
Yeah.
And while he was reacting, Peter reacted to everything, and and I guess somewhere along the line, I read the Exodus portion, and I got the veil, and I got the whole.
Oh, yeah.
I got that relationship, but it wasn't a big deal with the Methodists.
Mm-hmm. I just didn't know, a lot of times some of these things that aren't real, you're just kind of go like, okay, what is that really? We tend to sometimes avoid talking about them in the church. There's things that Jesus says that, it's like that last week, the gospel lesson last week. I can tell you in churches where they pick their own lessons, that's not one they pick.
Well, he does come across as a bit of a scold.
Yeah. It's he has his moment, and of course, the only thing that's sometimes bad is you're not really getting always kind of the whole picture. And we were talking about last week and this is even true with this. To really understand this, there were no originally chapters and verses, and that basically it was the gospel. It was a written account of Jesus's life from the apostles doing their best to try to recollect that. Mm-hmm. And so when they're writing this, sometimes what they begin in chapter 15 continues to chapter 17 of what we have today. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you just get, that's the problem with those. We get sometimes this piecemeal stuff, and you're like, okay, that's just weird. Or Jesus, what he just said there, you can take some parts where he's saying what they call the hard sayings of Jesus, and if you don't include what he says in part 2, it sounds like that's not the Jesus we were told about. Mm-hmm. But you got to read into kind of the whole thing, so it makes it kind of difficult.
One other aspect that we had in one of my classes we talked about was that where they looked. They lifted up their eyes and they saw no one but Jesus. There was this whole Trinity idea, because you had the law of Moses and you had Elijah, and then all of a sudden they were the 3 in 1 at that
Mm-hmm.
point on a Jesus scale. And that was something I had a hard time wrapping my brain around. I understand what they're saying, but by the same token, is that a valid idea, concept, or whatever?
That's interesting. Well, Clive, we've just been kind of talking about some of the parts of this from the gospel and things that are kind of that if you're just reading, it's easy to gloss over, but they're really important things that are said. And, like we just kind of gloss over this point about, again, whenever the disciples kind of then have when all of a sudden that cloud comes and they're like, oh, and they're afraid, Jesus says and it's just very clear that it was very purposely put in there that he touched them and said, don't be afraid. And so and of course that's the Jesus we expect, it really is. But so on this last Sunday of Epiphany, we often get this as kind of a fulfillment of what we see, because Epiphany again means revealing or manifestation. And so this season has been about how is God being manifest to the world, and that in the incarnate Word, in Jesus. How, here he is, it starts with, and it's a whole thing also about it's for the whole world. This is not just about the people for Israel or the Jews, because the very first thing really is on the Epiphany of January 6th. It's about these foreigners, these Gentiles who come and acknowledge. That's a major thing. And actually for most people, your average Jew, that would be very insulting to think about, these Gentiles showing up, doing stuff like that. But this is all about that. This is being opened up. It's opened up, and this is happening. And Jesus teaches that this is for everyone, for the world. So we have that, and as we end, and of course, Ash Wednesday, this week it's all changes, and we begin the kind of Lenten journey. We can talk about that. What we're going to do is they have a specific. I found this that follows the Lenten lessons with some really kind of in-depth questions about, well, how does this fit into what we're, our spiritual life, and also how we live into being Christian, and kind of that in about as a Lenten journey. Mm-hmm. We can do that, but we can also have just some regular discussions about, kind of what is that journey kind of during this Lent. And, I grew up, and of course I'd never heard of Lent. The only thing I'd ever heard of Lent was what you got in the dryer, and I mean, that was Lent. And I mean, I had heard somebody say, oh, we're going into Lent. And I'm like, what? Which, basically means, spring is what it's supposed to mean. And of course, I know a lot of people hope that will come quickly. So, but, we'll kind of begin this time, and it's a shame that some people just get this very flat, that it's just about what you do outwardly. Like, okay, well, I'm not going to drink, or I'm not going to eat chocolate, and all that. Well, that's okay. If you're just doing that to do that, then what's the purpose? Go ahead and eat your chocolate. But if there's a reason why you're doing this, to bring, like when people fast, it's supposed to be so that it helps you focus on what you're saying you want to do, of reflection, penitence, and about coming into a deeper relationship. The whole point of fasting is not so, Jesus talks about this. There's that part where, they say if you're fasting, he said, in fact, this is the reading on Ash Wednesday. It says, don't look dismal and don't do all this, oh, I'm fasting, oh, I'm so holy. And it's like, no, it's not to draw attention to yourself. It's for you to draw attention to your relationship with God. So we'll kind of enter into that during the Lenten season. And again, I'm going to have on the Wednesday Eucharistes, there are specific readings that also focus with our theme of our journey during Lent that I'll have. And then on Tuesdays, of course, there'll be kind of the focus meditations, Lenten meditations with Carter. And then we'll have our Sunday class after church. So that'll give us 3 things. And also, I have another book that I'm going to be putting out, and I had it last year, a thing I put together on what is Lent, what are the practices, why do we do it, and all that. And I'll have that, and I'll put that out and make sure to announce that next week. And then you have these. I really, now, you've not seen these before, have you? Yeah. You've seen them from like what we had.
Yeah.
Last year, I had the one for Lent last year, and then they started doing one now for Advent too. It's a special season of reflection. This one, I invite look through it and everything. It has. What I actually love is, like, I can't believe how many of the writers. I know quite a few of them, and so I'm like, oh, and I have to admit they're good. They're really good, and solid people. One is the Bishop of Western Louisiana, which covers Shreveport, where I used to live. That was originally my home sponsoring diocese, until they canned me about 2 months before my ordination. So they have a thing in here talking about the living a brief overview. And the other good thing too here is in the introduction, they actually give here the Revised Common Lectionary readings for Lent. So it'll tell you Lent year A, so there's each week and the date. It gives you the readings even there if you want to do that. And then they have them for Holy Week as well. And then they have a section about ways you can use this as a personal devotion. This also, when I started to do, and it's really good, but I would have needed more time to kind of prepare, I think, for this. But I have used this, and I may do it next year. If everybody gets this, and there's a reflection for each day, and they focus on leading onto the focus of that week. And at the end, you have what I've done before is we had like a soup and supper, and then we had then a time where we gathered. There was like an opening prayer, there was a time of a reflection, and then all discussion questions of like saying, so like this one dealing about compassion, you know, it might be like, have you ever had to struggle with what that really means, and that, you know, actually giving it is harder than thinking about it, you know, or something like. And so we kind of talk and share that. But you can do, what it does is you can do this individually, and they do have places where you can do some reflections. The other thing in the back, they have the whole thing of scripture quotes, prayers, and practices for Lent. So that starts on page 73. And so there's first the scripture ones, then there's quotes that start on page 75, and then prayers that start on page 78. And they say who they're, you know, attributed to. And then this is actually kind of nice here too. On page 80, they have this called Spiritual Prayer Practices. And it's just kind of simple. They just kind of go through this. And they have a thing here because they have like loving kindness prayer practice and welcoming prayer practice, you know, and 3 steps how to do this and so forth. And then in the back are notes for reflections if you wish. So hopefully you will find this helpful. And they do start on Ash Wednesday, so not the first Sunday of Lent. So, and that's page 13. Okay.
So you read page a day or a section a day?
It's, yeah, you kind of, because it tells you at the top, like it'll say, like I turned to page 21, it says, on the left side it says the first Sunday in Lent over here, and it kind of gives that focus over there on the left side.
Yeah.
It's not the actual reflection, it tells you about this. And the kind of introduction, like it says, compassion is also one of those good things. Compassion means we have room to be with others and their suffering and their sorrow and the moments of bittersweet sadness, so forth. And it kind of goes on. And then over here, it says Monday, February 27th. So that's the day after the first Sunday of Lent. And the kind of focus there is called compassion and faith. And then it has this little short scripture thing that it does. And then Scott Stoner writes this. And then at the bottom, make it personal. Here's where it kind of gives you your reflection question. Okay. And then, you know, you turn the next page, Tuesday the 28th. It's called Scrapping Out Our Buckets. And then it gets into what that really means. So there's one for each day in there. Hopefully you'll find it helpful. If you don't, I'm sorry.
We get our money back.
What's that? Yeah.
We get our money back.
I just wish they published those in a audio format, because the number of chances I get to sit down and read something are quite low, and if I try to frequently, the rest of the family use it as a signal that I'm available for interacting.
Well, fortunately they're short.
Yeah, they are short, but if the moment I sit down I get pounced with, you know, oh, we need to talk about something, or Daddy, you know, come play with me or something, you know, it's, you know, I can't, you know, it's very rare that I can actually sit down and read a book, you know, and unless it's in an audio format, or if I'm in some sort of locked away space where no one's allowed to come into the room, kind of, you know, and I'm just so busy with construction recently.
Well, hopefully you'll get 5 or 8 minutes.
That's why I got into the bathrooms.
I wasn't going to go, I was thinking that, but I wasn't going to go there. I was thinking, hey, you know, wherever it works, you know.
Yeah.
I am going to send it out to the congregation also in a PDF, that if for some reason you prefer, you know, like you're doing stuff on the computer, you can do that. I actually have for me personally, it hurts my eyes to read very much on a computer screen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a hard time focusing more, whereas I can focus on a print a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
But some people it's the opposite, so
It's easier to make notes in these things.
well, I'm probably showing my generational, you know, thing and my age.
No, computer screens are just bad.
Yeah.
You know, e-ink screens can be okay if the font is good, but you know, that's if the font is good and the formatting is good.
I can handle, like, here, this is the electronic common prayer. So like you can go, there's even like the services. So say for something happened, I didn't have my prayer book, but I got my phone. I can go to like, if say I go to do a funeral somewhere else. I went, oh my gosh, where's my prayer book? I can actually go right here, and there it is. I just scroll up. But I have to admit, to me, it's very. I've seen clergy giving sermons where they're like this, and they're holding their phone doing this, and I'm just like, it's so distracting for me. I just haven't got used to it, I guess, you know. Actually, the Bishop of San Diego, she brings her iPad in.